Welcome to Interfaithing,
a podcast for and about Jewish and Christian interfaith families,
where we explore the question why families can embrace two faiths under one roof.
I'm Ari, the son of a rabbi with a degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary.
I'm Anna, the daughter of a minister with a degree from the Union Theological Seminary. We were co-teachers together at the Interfaith community in New York.
And 1 year of working together led to 15 years of friendship and collaboration.
To find us sitting here today, embarking on a new project.
Whether you are part of an interfaith family,
or you're exploring and interested in how different faiths interact with one another,
this is the space for you.
Subscribe to guarantee you never miss an episode.
And help us spread the Torah and gospel of interfaith wisdom far and wide.
And you'll also gain access to exclusive content like our holiday live stream events.
We hope you enjoy every episode.
Listen at your own pace.
Share with a friend.
And don't forget to subscribe.
This episode, we are unpacking the myth of you're a traitor.
By forming an interfaith family, you are causing a rupture.
For a full introduction to this episode, please check out part 1. And now, let's get to part 2. Okay, Anna, time for your next story.
Well, I am pleased to be bringing back part of my conversation with Susan Katz-Miller.
We originally met Susan Katz-Miller, author of Being Both, Embracing Two Religions in One Interfaith Family, in Myth Number 2, Part 2. So you're Jews for Jesus, right?
As a reminder, Sue herself is a child of an interfaith family, even though she was raised primarily with one religion. As a young adult, out of respect and wanting to understand both of the traditions that she came from, she decided to explore an interfaith identity. So many of the stories and what we talked about in the previous episode was recognizing the deep and difficult pain points, right? And whether it is explicitly stated to you, like trying to be interfaith is a problem, and what that does to people on the inside, and then how they have to wrestle with it. You get to hear what Sue has to say in response to part of her experience.
Okay.
So let's just
ready?
get to it. Yeah, let's just get into it and let her speak.
All right. Well, here now is a story from Susan Katz-Miller.
It was years of having to defend my Jewish identity to the Jewish community, which becomes really exhausting. And even though I still call myself Jewish, and in fact, I belong to the synagogue that my great-great-grandparents founded, so I am a card-carrying Jew. But when it came time to decide how to raise our children, I wanted to give them the gift of interfaith education that I knew that our public schools would not provide, that I did not have. My husband actually had said he would be fine with raising our kids Jewish, but it was very hard for me to imagine sort of putting them through what I went through of feeling on the margins and having to defend myself. And they would be a generation removed. They only had one Jewish grandparent, and it was a grandfather. So the quote unquote wrong side from the traditional Jewish viewpoint is that the religion is passed down by the mother. So, I've been dealing with that all my life. So for me, claiming an interfaith identity alongside the Jewish identity, which I still have, which I will always have, in part because my parents raised me that way, and in part because I find Judaism very compelling. But beside that, my interfaith identity has become, for me, something that's very empowering, something that's inspiring, something that I've spent the last 20 years working on, professionally. So I definitely wanted my children to be empowered by that claiming of the interfaith identity from the beginning.
Really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even in 2 minutes of conversation, Sue is able to touch on so many different elements and angles.
Yeah.
You
Could have
know,
used this one for any of the different myths that we had.
I
Right.
know. I know. It was one of those things that this moment in our conversation felt very important. Like, oh, okay, yeah, this is going to be a segment that we need to include. And
Right.
I finally settled on it for this conversation because in listening to it a second, a third, even a fourth time, I hope Sue doesn't mind me saying this, but there are still elements of that pain and discomfort in her voice while she's talking. And I think that
I don't want to pass this along. I don't want to pass along the pain to my kids.
Exactly.
Right.
So she's, speaking, I think, equally for herself and about her own experience and what it meant as a young adult to adopt an interfaith identity and like what that meant to people that she had already had to encounter trying to defend her Jewish identity. And over and above that, speaking as a mother, wanting to, in some ways, protect and she said, empower her children to potentially not have the same kind of experiences that she had to have.
Right.
Maybe feeling a little bit more alone and isolated through her process, that they at least would have a different kind of foundation.
Yeah, they wouldn't have to go through what she went through. And the foundation is stronger in the context of an interfaith identity, which I want to touch on shortly. I also found it fascinating that she mentioned the piece about the wrong parent, that her grandfather on her father's side was Jewish, and that is not the identity in which Judaism is passed along. I mentioned in a previous episode, for those who are tuning in the first time, a little bit about the history of patrilineal descent within Judaism. So I'm not going to go into that now. You're going to have to look back and hear one of the other episodes. I also found the point that she made about public school to be a really interesting piece to it. How they would not be teaching faith learning in public school. One of the things that we've talked about is how we came to this work of serving interfaith families, particularly Jewish Christian interfaith families, from the perspective of interfaith dialogue, of how the religions can work to coexist. And given all the challenges in the world at large, especially thinking about religious conflict and how religious conflict is still something that is very much a part of strife, of pain, of war in the world, that wouldn't schools want there to be greater religious understanding, greater learning about the different faith traditions? And yet, the experience that I've had trying to work with public and even some private schools around, hey, I'm happy to share a little bit about Judaism. One of the biggest challenges that I faced in offering that option is that there are many folks who see public spaces and institutions like public schools as a place that's actually supposed to be devoid of religion, because they're worried that the point of any religious teaching is evangelizing, is to try to get the kids who are not of that faith denomination to join that faith denomination.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is that you have a great number of kids who, at the right stage of life, to be able to learn how religions interact together, and they don't get anything because we're scared about how the religious teachings could end up leading someone down a path of adopting that particular faith. And we're scared about that particular result. But I think it's so interesting to think about what would it look like if interfaith dialogue, of interfaith learning, was part of our educational system. Is there a way to make it so that it's not centered around conversion? Is there a way to make it so that families, kids, communities could be able to really learn about one another and from one another?
Yeah, and I'm going to speak personally about that because I definitely see part of my own story and also like the shift in what I experienced in especially high school compared to what it seems like is happening in public schools today. This fear and concern that you were just expressing, right? That any information automatically leads to indoctrination, and or that it's also a misunderstanding and misrepresentation of the separation of church and state, that for some reason topics of faith and spirituality cannot be discussed in public schools. which is ridiculous. And again, a gross misunderstanding of what that part of the First Amendment actually says. I'm also the daughter of a public school teacher, so
Right.
I'm speaking from a particular place of.
I say amen to everything you just said.
I know,
Amen,
I know you do.
sister.
And so this isn't, I'm going to give that caveat because my mother as a public school teacher and then my father as a minister, like this was a topic of discussion in our household.
Mm,
And at the same time, many of my teachers throughout my school experiences were also people who went to our churches.
right.
So they were teaching me in the classroom, but then coming and sitting in the pews on Sunday morning and, you know, receiving the message that my father was giving from the pulpit. So those dynamics were at play. And let's not forget, I was also growing up in the South. And it would be really easy, I think, and maybe this was true in other communities, for people to have just been assumptive that nothing else except Christianity mattered. Therefore, something like interfaith dialogue, even in the context of like world history,
Right.
doesn't matter unless it is in the service of a Christian dominance narrative.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I found myself, at least in the 10th grade, in History of Civilization, where the teacher's approach was, to the best of her ability, honest and saying, at this point in history, X would have been true. At this point in history, a different X would have been true. And so, of course, yes, like US textbooks do still heavily lean toward the establishment of the European countries and what that means. And at the same time, that means that you can't avoid conversations like the Crusades.
Right.
That's a historical fact. You can't avoid the fact that the religious underpinnings of colonization, whether it was Spain and then England and all the other countries engaged in those acts, like that has religious underpinnings. And so you have to also tell the truth in order to tell history.
Right.
And maybe it's just me, but I was able to see that interreligious dialogue, like this planted a seed for me of wanting to understand how was it that the faith and the gospel stories and the things that I was hearing my dad preach about on Sunday mornings, feeling like it was in such stark contrast with the very aggressive Christian narrative that runs throughout the course of world and then US history.
Right. Given the conversation we're having, I'm thinking a lot about how Jews have often felt that when it came to faith in public spaces, we don't want faith to be part of, especially our educational system, because of that worry, right? When my dad would preach from the pulpit, the purpose of his teaching and education was to both educate folks about what Judaism has to offer, because he knew that many were not getting it from other places. And so here's a chance to really learn about Judaism. And we don't want other people, we don't want other institutions to be responsible for that kind of Jewish learning. And so the need for learning about one's own Jewish identity and what Judaism has to offer was something that's very important, and was also seen as not something that was the responsibility of the public at large. I remember one conversation I had with my dad about where to go to college. And this was before the days of applying to like 15 different schools. He said, you're going to go to the place that's right next door because it's a local school. We'd be able to really afford for you to go there. Or you're going to go to maybe the more expensive school, but that you'll get not just a Jewish education, but you'll get an advanced degree, a bachelor's degree in some Jewish topic, which for me was Bible. So the need for learning and for education is so great. And yet I think that there is a sense, and this comes back to the point about being a traitor, that when you learn about another tradition, or when you learn about something that is different, it can open up your mind to a new way of life, to a new way of thinking. When Sue was talking about, from her own background, being raised as a Jew, and that she's a card-carrying member of the Jewish community, which I love that phrase, right? Like, I have all these different identities, but I'm a card-carrying member of the Jewish people. And she expressed how Judaism for her is very compelling. It reminded me of a story where I was working with an interfaith couple, who were planning on raising their eventual kids with both. And because of the exposure that the Catholic partner had to Judaism, what she realized was that Judaism spoke much more to her than Christianity did. And so she actually decided to convert. And what I would say is, to some degree, that is success. Meaning, if someone finds their religious calling with another faith tradition, and you're opening up the door just to learn, and then you make that choice to walk through the door of becoming a card-carrying member of the people, I think that that is a sign of success. The challenge is, if you're on the other side of it, if they're leaving the fold, right? If they decide to become a member of the other faith tradition, then is there a feeling that, well, if they did not learn about this other faith tradition, then we wouldn't be going through this, right? We would not be forced to have to deal with a situation in which one of our people became one of their people. So I think that's also why education is seen as something that can be very challenging and problematic for folks. Because if you learn about another tradition, another faith, another way of being, you open up in your mind to the value of what that other tradition has to offer. And you can't really stop someone from continuing that path if that's something they want to go on.
Yep, totally agree. And I also feel, even from, my experiences in Christian community, there is this caution of, we don't want to be perceived as fully ignorant, right? Like, you have to know something about the faith that you are professing. And yet there is still an element of, we don't want to learn too much, because that's when, as you said, if your mind gets to be too opened up, then you might be, so there is this element of fear. And I still see it ultimately as part of the issues of control. And I don't mean coercive control or anything to the side of abuse, but it is interesting to me that if I think about my understanding of even just parts of Christian history, that if you consider that within the Catholic Church, you have the different orders, that if you did not get married and you also didn't enter the priesthood, that there would be other vows that you would take, such as like women entering an order of nuns, or like men becoming part of a monastic community, which is distinct from taking vows of priesthood. One of those communities you may have heard of are the Jesuits. And
I've heard of the Jesuits.
Right. The current Pope was a member of a Jesuit order, the first such, and that the Jesuits in particular became known for founding universities. In part because they wanted to keep pace with their Jewish and Muslim counterparts who were beginning to found universities, and they didn't want to be left out in the cold as a bunch of
we don't know anything.
Like illiterate, ignorant Christian communities. They wanted to be able to keep pace. And so kind of the paradox, the little bit of irony in here is that there have also been times throughout history where the Jesuits then become the ones to challenge what the Catholic authorities are otherwise saying, to challenge the teachings, to want to push Catholicism in particular to rethink their stance on a particular issue because of their education. And that there are times that the Jesuits are also seen as threatening within Catholic communities because of that. So there's this interplay that is exactly what you were just describing. And I can also say, as part of my personal story, I have laughingly and proudly said, like, sure, call me a heretic, because I'm willing to question my Christian background, that I am not just going to express blind faith. It's sit in a pew and be told what to do.
You're not just going to listen. You're going to be able to make up your mind about it.
Exactly.
To really be thoughtful. Think about it.
And that there were people in our communities who worried about me and expressed that fear toward my parents. Like, aren't you afraid that if she goes off and studies that she'll lose her roots? And my parents were like, no. No, she's fine.
It's the concept of roots and wings, that you want to be able to have roots that ground you, but that don't keep you grounded, that you can't take off. You're supposed to be able to get wings to be able to fly off in your own direction. Even that idea of the kind of freedom of an individual to be able to separate themselves from a certain kind of education.
Mhm.
I think that even that is a very modern idea that did not exist throughout history, but yet you do see some examples of these free thinkers who go out into the cities, as I mentioned in the last episode.
Mm.
You can't live in a traditional quote unquote community if you bring certain ideas that are going to be challenging to the status quo. It's fascinating to me because a lot of Jews like to say that, oh, we love to question as Jews. Like that's the thing we
Mhm.
do. Like for every Jew, there's like 10 different questions to be able to ask.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's not exactly accurate because in the Talmud, especially where there's a lot of questions being asked, the purpose of the questions is not to undermine the point that's being made. The point of the question is to solidify the opinion that is being offered by just clarifying it to a very fine degree.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if I were to say, which microphone is better to use for a podcast? Is it this old school microphone that I'm using or the new age one that Anna that you're using right now? And we were to have to decide which is the correct one. There are many different opinions, many different questions that could be asked to figure out which is the correct one.
Mhm.
But what we can't say is, why do you need to have a microphone in the first place?
Right.
Right? There are certain questions that cannot be asked.
Mhm.
And there are certain reasons for that. For instance, if you were a sage of a certain generation, you were not allowed to question the validity of an older sage from an older generation. Rather, you just had to say, well, what they're talking about is in reference to this other issue, and therefore I'm not in conflict with them. You could
Mhm.
be in conflict with somebody of your own generation, but you can't be in conflict with somebody of an older generation, as
Yeah.
if to say that the role of teacher and student, you as a student are never allowed to be able to tell your teacher you're wrong. Now, when you come to the modern age and universities and Jews coming into universities, you start to have a lot of questions being asked about the sources of scripture and Talmud. It allows for a kind of freedom of thinking that gives Jews the sense that we can ask questions about everything and that our job is to ask questions. So it kind of takes that model from the Talmud and kind of flips it almost paradoxically on its head and say, what we first thought of as questions to figure out what the rule is now a prescription to ask as many questions as we want and that no question is off the table.
Right.
So, what does that mean for what it means to potentially be a traitor? Because what I think, and Anna, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what we're arguing is that being a traitor, at least as it may be seen from the outside, as an underpinning, that when you learn about another faith tradition, when you gain education, you create the conditions in which you might leave the fold, you might leave the faith. And therefore, we have to be wary of education. And yet, I think a part of what Sue's story is saying is that she wanted to empower her children. She wanted to give them the skills to be able to experience both parts of their faith tradition in meaningful ways and gain their own understanding and their own appreciation of what faith means to them. To the point, in terms of being a traitor to one religion or the other, that, and as you and I have seen, through their education and through their learning, many kids who come from interfaith backgrounds say, I'm interfaith. I have Judaism, I have Christianity. I don't need to choose. Don't make me choose because I feel connected to both of these traditions. So, by virtue of learning about your traditions, you're also creating this new dynamic whereby each of the individual faith traditions may feel like individuals who feel connected to both faith traditions. That is traitorous because you're not choosing one or the other. But what we're saying is that education is actually the way in to being able to experience the meaning of these traditions in an authentic manner. It is the opposite of being traitorous because they're learning in order to come closer to both. The result of that is beneficial to both traditions, to both sides of the family, ultimately to the future of Jews and Christians around the world.
Absolutely. I have felt, even from 12, 13-year-olds that we were working with, they had an ability to ask questions and also to respond to questions being asked of them in a way that, when I think of myself as a 12 or 13-year-old, I wouldn't have been able to do that about my own Christian faith, because at that point in time, even though I had gone through confirmation, even though I had supposedly proved that I was going to take my faith seriously in a particular way, I still hadn't had to explore my faith in the face of that kind of criticism of, oh, but you can't really be X. You're not legitimate. You're a traitor. You're fill in the blank. There's something different that happens, right? And even in both of our origin stories, at least in mine, I know that some seeds were planted in high school, which I just described a few minutes ago, but my real exploration began in college. So I was already an adult. And with interfaith families, and Sue talked about this in a previous episode, throughout your entire life that you are in a family with two different faith traditions. Even if you're being primarily raised in one, know that the other exists. And you have to do something with that information. You can't wholly ignore it.
Right.
And so I think it just sets the stage for interfaith families, at least in our experience, to have very informed opinions about whatever their faith is.
Yeah.
And wherever they think it's going to lead them in their life.
Right. What it ultimately means to them. Amen, sister. That was a good one.
And yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Thank you, Sue, for leading us down that rabbit hole.
120 seconds of conversation, and you and I went around the world and back.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, we did. And hopefully you're still with us as we head to the next story.
We're not done yet.
We're not done yet. The story, Anna, that I want to share with you comes from Kate and Marielle. If you've just joined us, we were introduced to Kate and Marielle Schneider of the Interfaith Book Group in New York in Myth Number 1, Part 1, Judaism and Christianity Don't Mix. Kate is studying to become an Episcopalian priest. Marielle is Jewish, grew up in a conservadox family. And the story you're going to hear speaks to when you are being raised in a certain faith context. Your experience of that faith tradition gives you a lens to see the world. But in building an interfaith household, we have to think about how to hold different kind of symbols and ways of experiencing God that are contradictory, that are challenging. Or to put it in a very short way, can an interfaith family put up a cross in the home? And what does that cross mean to the Jewish partner?
I was going to jump in that I think actually a big part of It Won't Work that's separate from children is just the pressing reality of Christian hegemony, right? That Josh was talking about how it's often or sometimes hard for him to just sit and be in church and really wrestle with what does this mean for him as a Jew to be sitting in a church service right now. And that's something that, Marielle has expressed as well. It's a very difficult thing oftentimes. And I think it's important for me as the Christian partner to realize that it will always be harder for Marielle as a Jew to come to Eucharist, to Mass with me, than it will be for me to go to Friday night services. Because very little about Shabbat directly conflicts with my faith. And almost everything about a Sunday service at church conflicts with Judaism. And so there's not only that direct conflict, but I think it's also just the reality of centuries of oppression and violence at the hands of Christians towards religious minorities, especially Jewish people. There's a lot of generational trauma that comes with that. And I don't know, Marielle, maybe you can speak more about there's a fear that you were raised with of our people have often been under attack and continue to be so. And a lot of that is the Christians' fault.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things in the beginning of the relationship when we were talking with our spiritual director, if you will, who kind of helped us have these conversations, was like you describing what the cross meant to you and that symbolism, and me describing what it meant or what it symbolized for me.
Well, so let's do it right now. Like, what is
yeah?
When you
so
see
like
a cross, what does it
well,
feel like?
When at that time it was like fear and aversion. That's not a place for you. You don't have to go there. In fact, it's encroaching. And you described to me that it's a symbol of unconditional love and acceptance and
ultimate sacrifice.
Yeah.
And being able to put like community before self.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, I think all that to say, like, the history of violence and fear doesn't mean it can't work. It does make it more complicated. I think that's like maybe the bottom line to a lot of what we're talking about. It's not impossible. It's not wrong. It's harder in a lot of ways. It means that we have to talk more openly. It means that for me, I have to be able to acknowledge that history, to acknowledge the baggage that my presence as a Christian, my religious artwork that I moved into our shared apartment with, I have to acknowledge like what that feels like to my partner, and to be able to talk through that and to be able to acknowledge the hard things. And maybe that's just the theme of being in a multi-faith relationship, is acknowledging the hard things.
So that last line from Kate, that interfaith relationships are about acknowledging the hard things. You can't put it a better way, especially in thinking about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. And in the first part of this episode we dropped last week, the story of a Muslim and Hindu couple, thinking about the kind of violence that existed between those two different communities, particularly in India and Pakistan. So there are all of these different relationships among different faith traditions in which there's a lot of war and violence caused by religions. It's no surprise that you have certain intellectuals who decry religion as a human-made creation that seeks to control people and ultimately leads to the downfall of human society. Take away the God piece, take away the faith piece, take away the spiritual piece. Just look at the political piece, the military piece, and you can see how religion is used, how the symbol of love, of sacrifice, of acceptance, for one, is the symbol of fear and aversion and of death to another. And it's so interesting that we as human beings can ascribe both of those things to the same symbols.
Yes. And we just talked about it in the previous conversation around public education and how certain things get taught. We can't avoid, at least what I've talked about, as Christian dominance. The term Christian hegemony is very true and very real. There is a massive assumption that the underpinnings of this country, like how society, culture, religion is a part of culture, how all of those things manifest themselves in such a way that, like, you and I are speaking specifically about interfaith families existing here in the United States. I still have to do the work sometimes of reminding myself what I know to be normal is not the experience of you, my Jewish colleague. And it certainly is also not the experience of anyone else of a different faith tradition. I almost feel like there are, in certain places, it's easier for someone who identifies as an agnostic or an atheist to exist alongside a group of Christians than it is for two people from completely different religious backgrounds to coexist. And the symbolism piece is massive.
Yeah, it is.
Because it also touches on not just symbolism, but then iconography. And then we get really, really close to the conversation about idolatry. Because as I was listening to the story and then what you were sharing, I was reminded that, again, one of those interesting differences in the way that Christians express their faith is that we are not afraid to show images of God.
Right.
For better, for worse, right? Like,
because if God is able to come down into human form, then you obviously have a form, you have a likeness.
Right, the Imago
is-
Dei, yeah. But depicting Jesus and depicting God are still technically different things.
Oh, interesting.
You know what I mean? And so
Right.
having a depiction of Jesus, because Jesus was in that human form, I would be one of the ones to say, like, they're the same, but they're distinct, because then the whole conversation about the Trinity and what do we do with that?
Right.
But take something as popular as the Sistine Chapel.
Right. You got God there.
God is literally in the center. But for both Islam and Judaism, correct me if I'm wrong, at least on the Judaism piece, but like depicting God is not okay. If only because we are limited as human beings. It's not possible for us to know fully what God looks like. And just in general, out of reverence and respect, it's not appropriate for us to try to contain God in an image.
Right. Well, interesting. You should raise that point, especially about iconography. As a Jew, there's very little space between iconography and idolatry. So, what about these icons? And are you actually worshiping them if they're in your space? And there's this great text that I want to share. And as I go through it, I want us to think about how this text relates to this notion of what an icon is and also what an idol is, and the differences between the two. Because to be able to accept seeing the fear, aversion, pain of a cross, and to be able to accept seeing it as a sign of love and acceptance, is to understand that, oh, okay, so this icon could mean a variety of different things. All right. But here's a story that I think is really interesting along those lines. And it's taken from the Mishnah, which you've heard me say before if you've been paying attention to our episodes. Mishnah is the earliest part of the Talmud, together with the Gemara. They make up the Talmud. The Mishnah is about from the 1st century to the 3rd century of the Common Era, or AD, depending upon how you identify the centuries. And this story comes from a Mishnah talking about idolatry in Mishnah Avodah Zarah, chapter 3, Mishnah 4. So here is what it says. Proclus, son of Plosphos. Yes, there's a Proclus, son of Plosphos, which means some random not Jewish dude, asked Rabban Gamliel in Akko when the latter was bathing in the bathhouse of Aphrodite. Okay? So Rabban Gamliel, who is major rabbi, was bathing in the bathhouse in which there is a statue of Aphrodite. And so this non-Jewish man said to Rabban Gamliel, isn't it written in your Torah that from Deuteronomy 13:18, let nothing that has been prescribed stick to your hand? Now, what that particular sentence is referring to in Deuteronomy, as understood by rabbinic commentators, is that anything related to idolatry, you are not allowed to enjoy benefit from it. Lo neheneh, do not benefit from anything that is considered to be idolatrous. So it's a great question. And the Talmud likes to take up these individuals who are not Jewish to kind of ask really, really good questions. And the question really is, I'm not saying that you're bowing down to Aphrodite because you're a rabbi. I get it. You're not doing that. But aren't you benefiting from Aphrodite because you are enjoying the bath in a place in which Aphrodite is standing there as an idol, right? As this icon. So it goes on to say, why are you bathing in the bathhouse of Aphrodite? All right. I think it's a great question. Think about how could you have in your own home a cross? How could you have in your own establishment a Buddha or some other kind of deity? Rabban Gamliel has a fascinating answer. He said to Proclus, son of Plosphos, we do not answer questions relating to Torah in a bathhouse. Which is basically like, let's step outside and deal with this, because in a bathhouse, you are naked. You are doing whatever you need to do in a bathhouse. And that's not the place to study Torah, which it kind of is also the answer, meaning don't think at all that I am praying here, that I'm doing anything related to my Judaism here, but I'm living my life. I'm going to a bathhouse because everybody needs to take a bath. And living in a community in which there are these Greek bathhouses, this is what we do. So when he came out, he said to him, meaning when Rabban Gamliel said to Proclus, I did not come into her domain meaning Aphrodite's domain.
Right.
She has come into mine. People do not say the bath was made as an adornment for Aphrodite. Rather, they say Aphrodite was made as an adornment for the bath. So what he is saying here that I think is really important is that regardless of how someone might view this icon of Aphrodite, regardless if it's in the bathhouse or not, the point is that Rabban Gamliel is able to see this icon not as a divine figure, but simply as a nice statue.
Just as decoration.
As decoration. Exactly. It's here to adorn the bathhouse, to make it look nice. Because you understand what an idol is to you and that this is not that.
Mm-hmm.
So you could go on forever with this particular text, but I'm going to stop there. And one of the other pieces I want to share is a more recent story that I heard from a colleague of mine. This was actually a number of years ago. She had an interfaith family in her Episcopalian church, and they were doing communion. And one of the Jewish guys came up and did communion. And so my colleague said, George, what'd you do? Like, you're Jewish. You don't do communion. He's like, I needed a snack. Which, by the way, that might come off as a little
glib.
Glib, exactly. But if you think about it another way, is that he came up to be part of his family, to be close with them. And he had the ability to be able to not take what was happening in that moment, that ritual moment, as I am doing an act of prayer. I am doing something that is traitorous to my faith tradition. I am doing something instead that you do any day, which is have a snack, and doing it in this space. It's actually a meaningful one because I'm with my family.
I can just hear, I can feel out there in audience land that there might be some pearl clutching going on by some folks who grew up in Christian backgrounds where taking the sacraments, especially if you grew up as Catholic or in other Christian denominations where not everybody just gets to do that when it's offered. There are rules as far as taking the sacraments and what that means. And yet I hear this person say, like, yes, I'm here with my family and I wanted a snack. I know that I just said, like, hey, there's a glibness in that. And I also hear, okay, but this person was hungry. And as a human being, taking care of your basic needs, like, what was one of the things that Jesus regularly does when he interacts with people before anything else?
Right.
He meets their basic needs. And oftentimes that's through feeding. Correct.
Yeah.
It isn't that you've checked off all the boxes of like, now I'm able to participate in communion, or that it is not in fact sacrilegious for a non-Catholic person to want to participate in communion. Because again, like where is his heart in that moment? It's wanting to connect with his family and it's wanting to take care of his basic needs.
Right. And even if it wasn't, let's say, to take care of his basic needs, right? You just, whatever it may be, it's that he saw communion as an adornment to the experience of being together with his family there.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't for him a kind of religious symbol. And that, I think, is sort of the difference between what might be iconography and idolatry. Idolatry is when you take a symbol of another faith tradition and adopt it as your own that isn't authentic to however you want to define authenticity in this regard, whether it's tradition, whether it's your family, whether it's yourself, whether it's your connection to God, whatever it may be. But with iconography, it is okay if someone doesn't ascribe that same level of connection to it, whether it's communion, whether it's with Torah, whether it's with whatever the thing is that is part of that religious landscape. Yeah, this is just a way that we do religion. This is a way that we do faith and tradition. And in fact, by virtue of them not ascribing that level to it, it allows them to be in this space together with me. And that's what's so beautiful.
It is beautiful. And if Christians believe that communion, whenever it is offered, is replicating the moment of Jesus's Last Supper with the disciples, a traitor was among them. And Jesus knew that. He knew. And Judas was still allowed to partake.
Interesting. That is very interesting. So it's hard to summarize because now we're at the end of
I know.
both of these parts of the episode of kind of all the different things that we've talked about, which just means you're going to have to listen again to uncover more. But, touching on education, touching on iconography, idolatry, touching on how that feeling of being a traitor is something on the inside. That we have
Right.
to
What
kind
Josh
of-
had. Mm-hmm.
Right. And as we're having this conversation, I'm thinking a lot about my own story of going to pray in a church and what that really means and what that looks like and feels like. And I actually think that my view of it is now a little bit different given our conversation about iconography and idolatry. So I think a lot of what we're saying here is how important it is to keep an open mind, to be empowered through learning and through education, and not being afraid of where it lands, where we land or where it ends up or where we take off to. And it's not easy to give up the fear of, I don't know where this is going to end. I don't know where they're going to go. Are they going to leave the fold? And to be scared of that kind of learning, but it's for the person's benefit and ultimately, I think, for everyone's benefit.
Yes, and you just created a segue for like what's coming, right? Like this is part 2 of our myth of You're a Traitor, and we're wrapping up season 1 with unpacking the myth of you just don't take XYZ seriously, that the apathy, you just don't care. Right. And we've already explored that in some ways through these conversations. And so we're going to get into that even more, that people who are actively exploring, actively asking the questions and trying to build a life with their partner, with their family members, where both of these backgrounds, both of these traditions can be respected, that is a sign that there's nothing apathetic about their approach.
Right.
And I would also just offer and remind that this accusation of you're a traitor is a heavy one. And it is also something to be taken seriously. We heard Josh, it can come from the inside. From Sue, it can come from the outside and put us in a posture of defensiveness, of constriction, of a feeling like we need to kind of make ourselves small so that there's like a shield or a shell surrounding us. And yet one of our other conversations, I think in the first part of this episode, also talked about what it means to empty yourself, to open yourself in order to be a vessel for other things to move through you and to happen.
Right.
It's very vulnerable, but instead of crouching down in a defensive posture, it's very powerful to be open.
Yeah. I love it. Being vulnerable to be powerful.
Mm-hmm.
That vulnerability and power are intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
Like a friendship bracelet.
Well,
that wasn't me. That was Kate, Mary.
No, that was Kate. Yes.
But thank you all for listening and looking forward to our final episode, which you'll be able to hear it in 2 weeks.
Until then.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to part 2 of episode 5, You're a Traitor.
We hope you learned and laughed with us.
Subscribe to guarantee you never miss an episode.
And we want to thank our supporters and contributors, our families, and all of our featured storytellers.
We also want to give a special shout out to our composer and music producer, Pablo Lengain.
Subscribe, share, leave a review, and send us a message. We would love to hear your feedback and to learn more of your stories.
Find us on any of your podcast platforms to subscribe, and you can also find us on interfaithingpod.com.
Like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
And if you really like what you hear, please consider supporting us financially at patreon.com/interfaithing.
So until we meet again, take care.
Stay curious.
And
keep
interfaithing.